For those of you who've spent even a little bit of time at the Florida resort in the past 2 years, you know that Epcot is the center of construction. The old Future World is a set of construction walls, some of which have come down in the past month. And so today, I have a trio of stories about Epcot, and we'll use these to look at new elements inside of the park. We'll look at the new ride and also some new restaurant areas. We'll also explore a couple of stories that, as far as I know, haven't been discussed much, if at all, in the fan community. So again this week, we have an omnibus episode, Strange Stories of Epcot, that allows us to talk about some things that are also new. So if you have your earbuds in, if you have your cruise control set, or if you have your walking shoes on, here we go. Part 1. Shoes and where to find them. It's part of human nature that when you enjoy a place, you want to take a memento back home to remind you of the experience. Ask any Imagineer, and they'll tell you that this is the underlying reason why, since the 1980s or so, that most large Disney attractions exit through the gift shop. This is the moment when guests are most likely to purchase a t-shirt or plush that reminds them of Flight of Passage, Radiator Springs Racers, or Expedition Everest. As a side note here, I'll point out that in endless guidebooks, I've seen as a popular suggestion that parents interested in saving money pre-purchase Disney souvenirs from someplace like Target and then hand them out to their kids while they're at Disney World or Disneyland. But this only works with the youngest of kids, who can be tricked into thinking that these souvenirs are actually from the park, because it ignores the underlying psychological desire. Most kids don't simply want a plush Mickey. They want a plush Mickey that specifically came from the park that they want to remember. That is, they don't want an item so much as they want the item to be a reminder of what they experienced. Anyway, back to our story. Souvenirs are a way that people as a group commemorate meaningful trips and experiences, from a tassel saved from graduation, to a shell collected at the beach, to a wine glass from a unique dinner. Souvenirs remind us of temporary or peak experiences. It's an opportunity to take part of the experience with us. But there's a similar drive that people feel when they're about to leave a long-standing experience that they enjoy. People often want to leave behind a piece of themselves. They write their name in wet cement outside their childhood home. They put their photo up in the boardroom of an office shortly before retiring. They place a team trophy in a display case at their high school, indicating what they accomplished with others. Even Walt Disney himself was interested in personal leave-behinds. He presumably left his initials on his elementary school desk in Marceline, Missouri. This impulse can be observed at Disney parks as well. At all Disney Castle parks, there are names of significant contributors on windows down the entrance street, which is usually Main Street. In Disneyland, there's a wall inside the Matterhorn where cast members sign their names. In recent years, cast members have written their names on construction materials as new attractions were built. In 2017, for example, cast members wrote their names on the highest beam inside of Galaxy's Edge so that their identity would always be fused with the place, hidden inside layers of artificial rockwork. But for years and years, there have been less official ways that cast members have left behind pieces of themselves before leaving the resort or changing roles. And for some, this involves shoes. If you've heard of one of these activities, it's likely the shoe tree out near Fort Wilderness. The tree is actually in the water of Bay Lake next to a couple of buoys. For decades, this tree has been the center of a ceremony for cast members who've worked with watercraft. I've been told that if you've worked with watercraft long enough to know about it, then you can participate in this tradition before you leave the company or move on to a new division. Anna cast members last night in watercraft. Typically, a few friends go out on a pontoon boat as the shoe tree is fairly close to the shore in shallow water. They angle in the boat, and then with only the light of the moon, The person who is about to leave takes a pair of their white deck shoes with the laces tied and tosses them up into the tree, where they hang like oversized holiday ornaments. Then the pontoon boat, under the cover of darkness, sputters back to the dock. If you ever want to see the tree, it's right along the route the launch boat takes from the Magic Kingdom to the Fort Wilderness campground. Maybe a quarter a mile or so before the campground dock on the right, you'll find a low tree marked with those buoys. If you look up in the branches, you'll find dozens of white sneakers hanging there, markers of people who have likely spent years on watercraft before life took them elsewhere. But this is not the only place on Disney property where shoes became a parting custom for cast members as they left their jobs. In the shoe tree, you'll find dozens of shoes. In ways, it's an elegant display. But a decade ago, in a different location, there were hundreds and hundreds of shoes, piled up only a few feet from guests, but hidden from view. Thousands of guests would pass by them every day, not realizing they were traveling past one of the largest shoe mountains in the world. The location of this massive shoe mound was in Epcot, in the Norway Pavilion, and it existed between the late 1980s and 2014 on the old Maelstrom ride. On a cast member's final day, they would travel out onto the flume in one of the boats, carrying a shoe or two. And when they were sure no manager would spot them, they'd toss the shoes over the sets behind the Vikings, polar bears, or possibly a troll, with the shoes clumping down on the far side of the display. Again, a leave behind. Disney executives were aware of this custom, but they didn't know how many cast members had participated in it until Maelstrom closed down in preparation for the space becoming Frozen Ever After. One of the first things the work crew needed to do, long before they removed the animatronics or the sets, was to remove the shoes. I've talked to multiple people who worked on this. One person described hauling the shoes out in large boxes. Another said groups of shoes were gathered up in trash bags and dragged out of the attraction. One person told me that there were, quote, hundreds and hundreds of shoes, and then explained that just when you thought you'd removed all the shoes, you'd find another. Even when the demo team thought they'd removed all the shoes, they'd find more wildly tossed behind equipment storage areas. The shoes, it seemed, were endless. The Frozen Ever After attraction was one of the first to have a lot of creative input from the Florida Imagineering team, rather than being managed largely by the main team out in Glendale. In many newer Disney attractions that take over existing show buildings, there is often a visual pointer to the attraction that used to occupy that space. When the Winnie the Pooh Dark Ride took over the space once occupied by Mr. Toad's Wild Ride, an image of Mr. Toad was left inside the ride, handing the deed to the building over to Al. When the Little Mermaid attraction took over space once occupied by the 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea attraction, Imagineers worked in an image of the Nautilus submarine into the ride's exterior rock work. But when Frozen Ever After occupied the building that once held Maelstrom, Imagineers also wanted to create a tribute to the hundreds of shoes left behind by former cast members. And it's not easy to find. I had been told that it was there repeatedly, still I had to crawl up on a counter to see it. It's toward the end of the extended queue area, in an area arranged as Oaken's shop. If you look up, you'll find one pair of dark shoes set on a high shelf along with other tributes to the Maelstrom attraction that once inhabited this show building. There's a small figure of a polar bear standing high on its hind legs, just like the one that was once featured in Maelstrom. Also, there's some trolls, including a multi-headed troll, similar to the one that in days past sent boats down the falls backwards. And then with them are a set of black shoes, just like those worn by cast members for decades and piled up behind the sets and artificial rockwork of the old attraction. You can find the shoes if you walk through the full queue. If you go through the lightning lane, you'll enter the main queue just after Oaken's shop. But if you're in the full queue, which is usually 60 or 90 minutes long, think of them as an added discovery just before you enter a boat to view the animatronic world of Arendelle. If you do go through the Lightning Lane, you can ask a cast member if you can double back into Oak and Shop if you want to see them. And that reminds me that our 3 segments today are both stories and information. Genie Plus is changing its attractions for summer. It's not a secret that on busy days, Genie Plus runs out of availability for highly desirable attractions, which causes complaints from those using the paid Genie Plus service. To build capacity in the regular Genie Plus lineup, Disney will shift some attractions previously on the individually paid Lightning Lanes over to the inclusive $15 Genie Plus service, at least until August 7th. In the studios, Mickey and Minnie's Runaway Railway will shift to the bundled $15 service, in the Magic Kingdom, Space Mountain, in Animal Kingdom, Expedition Everest, and in Epcot, where the resort expects peak crowds due to the new coaster, 2 rides will join Genie Plus. Frozen Ever After is now part of the bundled $15 Genie Plus lineup, and after Memorial Day, starting on Tuesday, May 31st, Remy's Ratatouille Adventure will leave the individual Lightning Lanes and join the paid bundle. If anything, multiple changes to Genie Plus, like this in its first year, suggest that problems in the original design are fairly significant. And if you have a trip planned later this year, you might want to check the policies around Genie Plus before you go, because almost surely they'll be updated again by the end of the year. Lastly, if you're listening to this episode a long time after it was released, maybe in the distant world of 2026, you already know how the saga of Genie Plus pans out. I'm guessing there'll be a lot of changes. But realize all of us back in 2022, we're still struggling through these issues trying to understand how best to engage this new service. But if you do use Genie Plus for Frozen Ever After in 2022 or maybe 2026 or even later, just double back once you join the main queue into the last room of the extended queue. There, up on a shelf, tucked back away from easy viewing, you'll find the shoes that, over nearly 25 years, defined a cast member tradition at Epcot. But now, on to another story. Part 2, Coffee versus the Castle, a battle of the brands. Here's the well-known story. In the early 2000s, Disney managers noticed how many guests were coming to the parks carrying a Starbucks cup. At one point, they counted such guests as they passed through security. But it's a little more complicated than that. On the Starbucks side, executives found repeat requests through their MyStarbucksIdea.com webpage of customers asking to open a Starbucks location inside the various Disney parks. But one of the first pieces of connectivity between Disney and Starbucks happened in 2006, when Orrin Smith, the former CEO of Starbucks, joined the Disney Board of Directors. Bob Iger called Smith a, quote, unabashed Disney fan and, quote, a truly great friend. But his inclusion on the board also set up links that helped integrate Starbucks into the Disney parks. 3 years later, in June 2009, Starbucks opened a store in the Disney Village at Disneyland Paris, which established a working connection between the two companies. This store was outside of a theme park, in a general shopping area, which meant that the store could look like most Starbucks. White lettering, mermaid logo, green background trim, all of it surrounded by a wood and stone exterior. Then, in 2011, the company D-Store, which is for cast members at Disney World, started to feature Starbucks options. And then, a little later, as Nescafe was leaving the parks and Joffrey's became the official coffee of Disney World, there was also an opportunity to include one Starbucks location in each of the American parks. Quote, Starbucks and Disney have many things in common, said Arthur Rubenfeld, president of global development for Starbucks. We share a passion for providing excellent customer service, delivering high quality in everything we do, and ensuring that every experience with our brand exceeds our customers' expectations. But this idea the idea of their brand is also where the problems began. The first Starbucks location in Florida was slotted for the Magic Kingdom in the Main Street Bakery. Unlike the location in Paris, this Starbucks would need to merge into the theme of the area, essentially turn-of-the-century America. This meant no modern lettering, no green and white contemporary mermaid logo. The bakery would need to, quote, be designed to fit the theme of its surroundings. Cast members, of course, would, quote, wear a costume consistent with the early 20th century look and feel of Main Street, USA, which was not a problem for Starbucks. But a revised presentation of their logo was. The initial workaround for Disney designers was to ask Starbucks if they had an older logo, something that suggested an earlier time period. Starbucks did have this, a heritage logo from 1971. And if you Google this, you'll need to find the original 1971 heritage logo, not an updated version which is far more tame. The original heritage logo features the two-tailed mermaid entirely nude, breasts and nipples fully exposed, with the mermaid holding one tail in each of her hands. Here's a description the company uses to describe this logo. Quote, in 1971, Starbucks Coffee, Tea, and Spice displayed a mythical two-tailed mermaid inside of a circular ring in a coffee brown color palette. The coffee shop's name spun around the logo, encasing the provocative details of the graphic. The mermaid or siren's upper body was completely exposed, even bearing a fully visible navel. The siren was born from a 16th century Norse woodcut of, you guessed it, a two-tailed mermaid. Designers at Disney saw this logo as a little more than provocative. In short, they freaked out. There was no way that a logo on Main Street could feature a topless mermaid whose bare breasts and nipples were rendered in sharp and graphic exact detail. There was also a good bit of concern that the mermaid, with the way she was holding those twin tails, was configured to present her in an openly sexual pose. The solution here was to redo this graphic, specifically by adding flowing locks of hair to strategically cover her exposed breasts, and then to crop the image so that those nether regions were less prominently featured in a sexualized manner. This did not go over well with designers at Starbucks who believed that they should be in charge of the presentation of their logo, in the same way that Disney controlled the presentation of its iconic castle logo. But this discussion led to a new heritage-style logo, one in which Starbucks designers concealed the bare breast with slightly different strands of hair. They also nudged up the tail section a little to conceal the hips and belly button area a wee bit more. I'm pretty sure that this is also the basis for the revised heritage logo that they've premiered on other products at about the same time. But this redesign allowed the project to move forward on Main Street with a light redressing of the logo and a cafe whose interior, even with the wood trim, felt reasonably close to the type of Starbucks location one would find in a big city. Disney designers were a little more hopeful that the second location, the one over in Epcot, would move forward with fewer problems. As the Starbucks store, back in 2015 and 2016, was arranged in Future World, Starbucks was free to use its regular white lettering and to display a reasonably sized version of its current logo, the green and white circle of the crowned mermaid above the entrance. The problems here came when the Disney team was hopeful that they might arrange a theme design into the interior of the restaurant, aligning it with the near-future feel for a cafe. After all, there were other installations such as Club Cool that combined a corporate identity with a Disney-style show. Disney's solution was to create an indoor water feature, a type of water wall, that would interact with the Fountain of Nations show in the courtyard. Every 15 minutes, when the Fountain of Nations went through its 3 to 4 minute display, the water feature inside Starbucks would go through a similar show as well. Water would be arranged in that wall display, moving in time to the music for the outdoor fountain show, with a handful of different shows each day synced to the music of Disney films, old theme park shows, and music originally composed for the fountain. Ideally, this indoor show would draw an audience into the store just to see the display, and once they were there, they'd buy an espresso or a latte. But execs at Starbucks weren't interested in displays that would add entertainment to their store space. They wanted a store that would look and function as close as possible to the type of Starbucks that existed in urban America. This was the model they felt would be the most successful in the park, the one they knew how to manage. During the design process, Disney and Starbucks went through over a half-dozen design options for Epcot until they ended up with a store that looked very close to a typical Starbucks. In this, it was a battle of brands, the Disney show-focused brand versus the Starbucks cafe-focused design, something that continued as Starbucks evolved at the park. And that brings us up to this past month when a new, much larger version of Starbucks opened at Epcot. I was there during its opening weekend, and I have some observations as to how this space is reshaping the visual mood of Epcot. There's some pros and some cons. One of the large questions here, as I see it, is which company's identity most owns this space. The history of the Disney parks is also a history of sponsored space. In the 1950s, Disneyland out in California was filled with sponsored space, from a multi-room display of contemporary bathroom features to another display that showcased modern uses of aluminum. But over time, the presence of such sponsored space declined as Disneyland in the 1960s and 1970s more fully managed most areas in the park. But with this redesign of Epcot, and particularly of the store, the pendulum is in places swinging back more the other direction. Inside this new Starbucks, one brand's legacy and identity is a little louder than the other brand's legacy and identity. As part of the proposed Epcot redo, a little over 2 years ago, the Electric Umbrella and InnoVengeance East closed for what was then, in that pre-pandemic period, believed to be a massive reimagining of the Future World section of Epcot. During the pandemic, some of these projects would continue forward, in part because demolition had already started on old buildings, and other projects would be dropped largely due to costs during a period of significantly reduced mid-pandemic visitation at the parks. The old Electric Umbrella and InnoVengeance East would give way to Connections, one of the largest dining areas at the resort. The indoor space is massive, with about 800 seats and tall windows that open to the courtyard, or at least the courtyard once some more construction walls come down. About half of Connections is called The Eatery, a modestly priced counter-service restaurant which in many ways is a step up from similar restaurants in the park. It has open work areas where you can watch cast members making bread used for sandwiches. The other half of Connections is the new Starbucks location, which is larger than any Starbucks location I've ever visited. In this, at least, it's better equipped to manage the deep line of coffee addicts, myself included, looking for a caffeine fix at the start of the day. But in this space, again, there's a reimagining as to how the Disney and Starbucks brands merge inside of the parks. The term brand has many meanings. It can be a logo that identifies a product, it can be an attitude that identifies a company, but in this case, I would like to think of brand as a way that an environment imparts a feeling to those who visit. The brand of the Disney parks, that is, the feelings that these spaces give guests, has changed over time. During the 1960s, it was a sense of entering an environment that was visually keyed to the backlot experience of a Hollywood studio. To put it simply, you entered the world of the movies. An entire training program was even arranged around this principle, in which employees thought of themselves as cast members in a large, elaborate stage or film production. Over time, the tools of themed space changed so that Disney parks didn't just represent filmed environments. They represented the past, such as Liberty Square, or a cultural environment far from my home, such as the Germany Pavilion, or the natural environment of Africa. In the past decade, the parks have pivoted back to Walt's original conceit. Many elaborate lands, such as Galaxy's Edge, Pandora, and Cars Land, present again the world of film. In the 1950s, this representation of themed space at Disneyland was largely achieved through visuals. As Imagineering evolved beyond art directors from the 1950s to the present day, the depths of these experiences changed as well. In the 1970s and 1980s, Imagineering consciously incorporated the skills of theater. With this came a greater emphasis on lighting, sound, and costume design. And more recently, Imagineering has embraced what I'll call experiential artists and technicians. With these came a focus on aromas, textures, and a continuously mapped environment. But to loop back to my main idea, for me the experience of a Disney park is the sense that I am leaving the familiar world and stepping into someplace exotic. Whether that world is based on film, natural environments far from my home, the historical past, or the cultural environment of other countries. For me, that's a pleasurable experience. I'm lifted up out of the familiar and the anxieties of contemporary life and placed into a different realm. For me, I identify that as the brand experience of a Disney park. I think my kids would call this the vibe of a Disney park. I also frequent Starbucks almost every day. In my house, I drive the kids to school each morning. I pack up the kids, there's 2 of them. I also pack up the dogs, there's 2 of them as well. And together we all drive over to campus. I walk the kids up to the gate where I talk with them and their friends for a few minutes. And then once the bell sounds, I take the dogs and head over to Starbucks, where typically I get a blonde roast with a little cream and stevia. The brand experience of Starbucks for me is one of reasonable efficiency, a pleasant community environment with open space indoors and outdoors. There's better coffee out there, I'm sure, but I live in a tiny little town. I'd have to drive down to one of the cities to get it. And Starbucks is consistent, fairly good, and the people who work there are friendly. I'm not sure they know me by name, but they definitely know the name of my dogs. But this experience is different than the one I associate with a Disney park. In terms of which brand experience most defines this new space at Epcot, it's clearly Starbucks. Except for the large dining space, I could very well be in my Starbucks back home or one in Los Angeles or New York. So, though this is a very efficient space, it's able to serve customers far faster than either of the 2 previous locations in Epcot, and though it offers something I enjoy, it's a departure from the underlying feeling or brand experience that I most relate to the attraction shops and restaurants inside of a park. For me, it doesn't feel deeply connected to the larger experience of passing through those tap styles and being in the park. But I also recognize that this type of corporate presence is also a throwback to some experiences that defined areas at Disneyland during Walt's lifetime, particularly in Tomorrowland. But this was before my time, before my mind started to sort out how I identified the pleasures of being inside the parks. So the positives here, and there are positives. The line in this new Starbucks moves far, far faster than it did in either of those 2 earlier Starbucks locations in Epcot. This is a plus and a recognition that a more robust operation was needed to satisfy demand, particularly in the morning. And the eatery on the other side of Connections offers modestly priced meals that range in price from $10 to $12. Many of them are excellent, far better than similar priced meals elsewhere in the park. For $11, the General Tso's chicken salad is one of the best, if not the best, modestly priced meals anywhere in Epcot. But there's also this. The space of the Starbucks and the eatery don't transport me out of the world I know. And beneath this, at least in part, is that decades-long struggle between two companies that are brand-focused. Disney, whose parks artistically lean toward the exotic, and Starbucks, whose cafes lean toward clean, open, familiar urban spaces. In this, Starbucks has defined the space inside of Disney far more than Disney has defined the space inside of this new Starbucks. And sometime on some future episode, we'll have to talk about some subtle pressure that a certain mermaid-identified company put on Disney to remove those skeletal mermaids whose bones were touched with vengeance, the ones that were hauntingly beached inside of Pirates of the Caribbean at the Magic Kingdom. But now on this episode, on to another story. Part 3. It was always a movie, right? There's been a lot of grumbling this past month concerning how the new coaster, based on Guardians of the Galaxy, is changing the underlying conceit of the old Future World section of Epcot, namely that this attraction is far more focused on film properties than the ideas of science, community, and technology that originally framed the park. And yes, that's true. But the battle to keep movie IP out of the old Future World was lost years ago when Nemo and friends took over the Living Seas Pavilion. But perhaps, more to the point, the attraction that Cosmic Rewind replaces, the Universe of Energy, was also influenced by a movie, both the Ellen DeGeneres version and the original. Only this was lost on nearly everyone who visited the attraction. Back in 1940, Walt Disney released Fantasia, a film that presented animation, often experimental animation, timed to symphonic music. The fourth and longest segment in Fantasia presented the history of the Earth and the universe, from the Big Bang to the formation of Earth as a planet, to the arrangement of continents, to early life and the presentation of dinosaurs. The finale for this sequence featured a T-Rex towering over a Stegosaurus with its angular head tilted up to eye the giant beast in battle. 20 years later, when creating attractions for the 1964 World's Fair, Walt adapted this sequence for animatronic figures. For those who have listened to our ongoing Book of Hench series, you know that Walt was hired by outside companies to create elaborate attractions for the New York World's Fair. In the Ford attraction, guests rode in Ford cars past dinosaurs and eventually cavemen. But some of these sequences were a direct presentation of Fantasia in animatronic form. After the fair, those dinosaurs were trucked out to Disneyland in California, where they were displayed in a show building alongside the Disneyland Railroad in an area called Primeval World. And when WED designers worked on an energy pavilion for Epcot Center, they reused this exact concept, the presentation of dinosaur dioramas directly modeled on Fantasia, for the attraction in the ExxonMobil Pavilion, the Universe of Energy. So as long as Epcot has existed, film images have occupied this space. Only now the emphasis of film images is much louder than that of science, technology, or those other ideas that originally framed Epcot. But this new roller coaster didn't start off like this. The original concept was to include another thrill attraction into a park that primarily caters to adults and children, thereby expanding out those attractions that might interest teens. The original concept was to create a science-focused coaster that explored the creation of the universe with the Big Bang. Quote, "We had our idea for. We didn't even call it the Omni Coaster then," Imagineer Wyatt Winter said, "but a coaster that we could turn and rotate you into the show building." So that idea, along with an idea for a coaster that was about the Big Bang singularity, kind of going through the cosmos, those were the two ideas that were out there. In this, the concept basically was to upgrade Space Mountain with a more modern coaster system, with also exploring the singular concept of the creation of the universe. As a side note, I wonder if anyone on that design team knew that the Big Bang was also in the same section of Fantasia as the T-Rex battle that was a centerpiece feature of the universe of energy. But as this concept was being developed, Disney executives considered ways that their intellectual property might be more deeply leveraged into a revamped version of Epcot. Disney was also looking for ways to incorporate Marvel properties into their Florida park, which was tricky. Before Disney bought Marvel, Marvel had entered into an arrangement with Universal Studios that licensed out certain of their characters, such as Hulk, Spider-Man, Captain America, and related heroes, to their theme park in Orlando, which gave them exclusive rights east of the Mississippi. Disney was free to use characters unrelated to those at Islands of Adventure. In terms of superheroes used in Marvel films, that list was fairly small. But among them were characters that hadn't been deeply developed in widely popular comics. According to Wyatt Winter, quote, "Then we got the assignment and thought of how do we put Guardians of the Galaxy here at Epcot. We kind of mashed all those ideas together." The finished result is a coaster that visually presents the Big Bang, includes Guardians of the Galaxy, incorporates a unique rotating coaster system, and serves to modernize the concept of Space Mountain. It's an awful lot for a 3-minute experience to accomplish. Previews for this new coaster, a coaster whose budget was rumored to be over $400 million, were held in April, though during this time elements were adjusted and additional lighting equipment was added. This past weekend, the last of those construction walls went down and the building was opened as a finished attraction. The park was surprisingly empty for the opening of a major attraction, far emptier than for the opening of Rise of the Resistance or Flight of Passage, which are similar e-ticket attractions in terms of their construction costs. The attraction is using boarding groups. There's no standby line. So for long-timers here, yes, you need to wake up at 6:55 a.m. so you can click into a group right at 7 o'clock. You need to move through that process quickly, as on Friday, Saturday, and Sunday, spots filled within seconds. And that is not a figurative exaggeration. I mean a few seconds. We've covered this procedure before, but as a quick review so that everyone is ready, boarding groups are available to all guests with Epcot reservations, and windows open at 7 a.m. and 1 p.m. You should be on the My Disney Experience app about 5 minutes before the boarding group window opens. If you're in the park, you should find a space that has a strong Wi-Fi signal. If you have a weak signal, walk around a little until it improves. In the app, go to the virtual queue section. It's on the main page, and then select Cosmic Rewind, which is the only option right now. Before the window opens at 7 a.m. or 1 p.m., click through to the point to confirm your party. The app should auto-load everyone from your My Disney Experience group with an Epcot reservation. Then, a few seconds before the top of the hour, hit that refresh button over and over so you click in as soon as possible. Individual seconds here matter, as on busy days, boarding groups fill extremely quickly. For the 7 a.m. window, you can click into that virtual queue from your hotel room or even at home. But for the 1 p.m. virtual queue, you need to be physically inside the park. The attraction also has a paid lightning lane. On opening weekend, it was $17, though it will go down to $14 on the Tuesday after Memorial Day. Resort guests can book this option starting at 7 a.m. Guests not staying at a Disney resort can book this after the park opens, which presently is 8:30. But in practice, this means that all of those Lightning Lane options will go to resort guests. If I had to take a guess, I'd say that there was a large number of paid Lightning Lane spots, at least on opening weekend, that were arranged for resort guests. If you were staying on property and if you were up at 6:55 a.m., you had an excellent chance of reserving a spot either through the free virtual queue or the paid Lightning Lane. I did talk to a number of people at the park, mostly locals, who did not find a spot either on the 7 a.m. or 1 p.m. virtual queue window. For me, the boarding group experience this time around was extremely smooth. It's also clear that they're loading parties faster than they initially expected. I'm guessing that they put in some buffer space for downtime, which didn't happen. On Friday, my initial estimated boarding time was 11:47. This was gradually moved up to 9:41. The queue area was mostly empty. It was a leisurely walk from the exterior of the old Universe of Energy building to the loading area, 15 minutes from outside to being seated on the coaster. My guess is that if there's minimal downtime, Disney will increase capacity in the boarding groups, likely leading to a modest 30 to 40 minute queue. Still, this is far better than other opening day queue systems. Despite the height of the building, and it is a massive building, there are no high drops. The track course is designed to leverage the turning radius of the cars to create unique gravity sensations for riders. Think of a Haunted Mansion dune buggy that can turn a full circle, but on a roller coaster track. The system has been nicknamed the Omni Coaster. The drops are largely banked spirals and twists, with the cars turning into or away from the spiral. The turning motions are fluid and smooth. For those of you concerned about the severity of this coaster, despite the cars turning on a central focal point, it's a relatively mild ride. And I have a sensitivity to extreme coasters, as opposed to my kids who can go on Rock and Roller Coaster or the Incredicoaster over and over. I'm good with one trip on each of those per visit. The track here is extremely smooth. It's a backwards launch, which is more mild and gradual than Rock and Roller Coaster. For me, I'd place this experience as less intense than Everest, yet more intense than Space Mountain, mainly because of the disorienting sensation created by cars that rotate like an omnimover from side to side while the train itself moves forward. The coaster and queue are arranged as a storytelling experience, and here let me put this up front. I'm going to talk about some story points on the coaster, but knowing these things beforehand, I think, will help you enjoy the experience more rather than detract from it. I've talked to many people who've ridden this coaster once, and their response is generally, we went through the stars, we saw colorful lights, we turned, there was a planet and the Guardians. With Rise of the Resistance, Disney has demonstrated that dark ride vehicles can be an effective way to present a complex narrative, in that case one of escape. But the motion and brevity of the coaster experience don't lend themselves well to the same type of narrative involvement. One of the beauties of Space Mountain is that you can move through the cosmos and focus on the thrills. That ride asks you to do nothing more than this. Cosmic Rewind, on the other hand, asks you to do many things simultaneously, to focus on the thrills, to feel comfortable with the experimental turning cars, to admire the environment, and to focus on a story of rescuing the planet Earth from the MCU villain Eson, which is a celestial, which for many park guests will be a new villain. Eson is a massive entity, far larger than a planet, who has been watching over Earth for centuries and growing disappointed with how Earthlings behave. But that is an awful lot for a person to manage in a 2-minute and 50-second roller coaster experience. So if you want to miss these spoilers, just move ahead 5 or 6 minutes. But I think knowing the story here will help you enjoy the experience more than it would detract from it. And as long as we're talking about Marvel elements, let's clear out a couple of other items. Over in Galaxy's Edge, Disney was extremely clear that the land and the attractions there existed at a specific time point in the Star Wars universe, specifically in the timeline between episodes 8 and 9. But that's not the case at all here. James Gunn, the director for the Guardian movies, has said repeatedly that Cosmic Rewind isn't part of the overall MCU timeline. He said specifically, quote, "It's its own universe, and this is not Volume 3, it's Cosmic Rewind, which is its own thing." And for people here who follow the Marvel world closely, this will explain why the ride has both adult Groot, who has regrown from a sapling, and Gamora, who is presently dead. Those two elements, in the MCU films anyways, should not happen at the same time. The ride functions as a kind of nonsensical best of in terms of characters related to these movies. And whether you like that explanation or not, that's the rationale that's given for why it doesn't connect to a specific time point in the MCU films. But back to the ride. Last year, with Ratatouille and The Secret Life of Pets, I thought that 2021 would be the year of the lovely queue. But Cosmic Rewind has an excellent queue and pre-show. The queue is arranged as a cultural display of the fictional planet Xandar. It includes a room that, like a circular planetarium, presents images of the galaxy and then moves into exhibits that depict life on that fictional planet Xandar, including a miniature map of a Xandarian city. And if you think this model looks a little like Walt's miniature of Progress City, that's probably intended. Walt and his drawing of Epcot the City, which is related to Progress City, are featured on the screen during the pre-show as well. Peter Quill, aka Star-Lord, who in the Marvel Universe was kidnapped from Earth in the mid-1980s, makes a joke about wanting to visit Epcot so he can see horizons and what he calls veggie fruit. On a weather screen, there's a circular storm identified as the Maelstrom, which was the name for that original attraction over in the Norway Pavilion. These inside jokes and references continue throughout the attraction, which for theme park fans makes the experience deeply enjoyable. The ride briefly even features the old Universe of Energy theme redone as a rock song. Drax calls the Big Bang the Ding Dang, which is what Ellen called it on her version of Universe of Energy. But in terms of developing the storyline, the pre-show rooms explain that though Xandar is millions of light years from Earth, the people there have created a piece of technology called the Cosmic Generator that creates jump points that, through hex tunnels, connects up different points of the galaxy. The pre-show also introduces the idea of the Big Bang, that Xandar and Earth, though trillions of miles apart, both had their beginning with the same cosmic event. In the next room, a commander explains that as part of your tour, you'll be teleported to a Nova ship for a demonstration of this cosmic generator. The teleportation effect is probably my favorite moment in the entire experience. I'm pretty sure that it's inspired by an effect that was once used in the Star Trek experience in Vegas, but it works very well here. In Vegas, guests were beamed up to a starship, and the effect, at least in Vegas, was accomplished by moving guests into a room with false walls, then lowering the lights briefly as those false walls were quickly lifted up and a false ceiling was inserted over the guests. When the lights came back up, they appeared to be on a new ship. The entire transition effect in Vegas took a couple of seconds and was stunningly effective. That experience was overseen by David DeVos. I don't know if DeVos worked on Cosmic Rewind, though he did work on Galaxy's Edge, so it makes me think that this was possible. The effect in Cosmic Rewind is the most effective moment in the entire show. And if there is a wow moment here, this is it. After being teleported up to a Nova ship, you are shown a cosmic generator, which, as you watch, is stolen by that Celestial. And this is one of the weak links in storytelling. DHI has terrible luck in pegging films in production for future attractions. Millennium Falcon: Smuggler's Run is based on a sequence in Solo, a film that few people saw. And The Adventure in Cosmic Rewind is largely based on the Celestial sequence in The Eternals, also a film that relatively few people saw. So as the enormous villain appears, one intent on destroying Earth, very few people in the room will recognize him, though the attraction anticipates a reasonable level of familiarity. Anyway, the Celestial explains that he has been watching humans for thousands of years and believes that this species has failed and needs to be exterminated. This is also vaguely reminiscent of the Eternals. The Celestial, using the cosmic generator, creates a jump point and then transports Earth, the planet, back in time, specifically to the Big Bang, to erase what he calls is an error. And from here, the Guardians tell us, the guests, to walk down to those evacuation shuttles, that is the roller coaster, to follow the Celestial and Earth through the jump point back to the origin of the universe. The mission presumably is to collect the cosmic generator from the Celestial and use it to return Earth to its present place, both in time and galactic space. The Guardians collect the generator fairly early in the ride, so the remaining experience is focused on keeping it from the Celestial and then putting Earth back in its place. There is an absolutely lovely moment in the experience where the coaster curves past a structure that resembles the Andromeda Galaxy with its spiral of stars. After that, again just going on the visuals, the ride then shows us that the Guardians have returned first the Moon and then later the Earth to its proper place. With this, the attraction ends. And so, some personal takeaways here. First, a couple of years ago, Rise of the Resistance demonstrated that a dark ride could create an actual story with rising tension and a climax that involved guests. The Disney designers figured out how to use show stages to create a unique story rather than to simply just highlight key scenes from a movie, such as in Frozen Ever After. This combination of technology and narrative worked well. With a coaster, however, the storytelling elements are difficult to follow. The narrative setup in the queue and pre-show is solid, but on the ride itself, there's a lot of forward movement and rotation which are consuming experiences in themselves. Unless you go on the coaster many times, let's say more than 4 times, the addition of a condensed story related through movie screens is likely too much to follow, especially over the short duration of a coaster experience. In ways, I wonder if that coaster that was originally arranged as a visual tour of the universe and the Big Bang by itself might have been a more successful pairing of the screens and the rotating coaster elements. It would remove the narrative, which might have made the experience less overwhelming. Next, 5 years ago, when Flight of Passage opened, my initial response after exiting the attraction was, I want to go on this again and engage that world. 3 years ago, when Rise of the Resistance opened, I had the exact same response. I did not have that reaction when leaving Cosmic Rewind. It's a smooth, solid coaster. Moving past the spiraling galaxy is lovely. The room transformation effect is stunning. But with Flight and Rise, the pre-show areas both led up to attractions in which new uses of technology transformed theme park experiences. For me, this didn't happen in this ride. Also, I think the queue and pre-show, with their humor and inside references, were in ways a more satisfying experience than the coaster itself. But again, I understand my bias. I'm not a coaster person, so maybe this is an experience that will speak more deeply to coaster people. Do I think that this is the best ride at the Florida resort? I don't. That's still Rise of the Resistance. For me, Cosmic Rewind is in the top 10, which is significant considering that at the resort overall, there's more than 50 attractions. Just as a personal list, I'd put the top attractions at the Florida resort in this order, based on which I think are the most overall satisfying or unique experiences. This way you can see if my tastes match or don't match yours. First, Rise of the Resistance, then Flight of Passage, next Kilimanjaro Safari, then Haunted Mansion, Expedition Everest, Soarin' Around the World, and then Cosmic Rewind. But also notice, I'm putting Cosmic Rewind above all the other coasters, including Space Mountain and Slinky Dog, though I think the conceit behind these other coasters is easier to follow than that of Cosmic Rewind. Space Mountain, after all, is a simple blast into space on a roller coaster rocket, and that concept is pretty easy to follow. At this point, days ago, I had imagined that we would loop back to Fantasia. In the early 1940s, Walt planned out many new segments for a revised version of Fantasia. And some of these, rather oddly and coincidentally, line up with elements of Cosmic Rewind. But as I'm recording this in a Florida hotel room right now, and as this week's episode is already pretty long, let's save that story for a future week. Next week is our monthly news and update episode. But after that, let's loop back to this concept. Some space-related stories that Walt originally imagined 80 years ago, but never brought to the screen. So we finally got to shoes and coffee and other things, including that new Epcot coaster. Hopefully, all this gives you some things to think about for the coming week and helps you enjoy your next trip to Florida a little bit more. I'll be back next week with a new episode. As next week is the first Sunday of the month, it'll be our news and analysis episode. As you know, we're an ad-free, listener-supported podcast. Without subscribers, we would simply cease to exist. We do just two things: deep dives on stories related to the history of the Disney studio and the parks, and news and analysis of current events as they relate to the Disney company. If you enjoy these episodes, please support our efforts by becoming a monthly subscriber over on Bandcamp. On Bandcamp, you'll find dozens and dozens of extra episodes, but the best reason to subscribe is to make sure that this podcast continues to exist. You can subscribe at dhipodcast.bandcamp.com. I'll also leave a link down in the show notes. Until next Sunday, this is Todd James Pierce.